This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Meadowscapes, a division of Matt's Landscaping, and Elise Harney Real Estate.
Hey, Mary, I am excited for today. How about you?
Thorin, I'm so excited because we have a Moxie by Proxy episode.
We haven't had one in a while.
We haven't.
I love these.
And to remind our listeners, Moxie by Proxy is when we have someone examining the Moxie of someone from the past. And in this case, we have documentary filmmaker, Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker.
Let's not forget that.
We won't. Pam Hogan.
Yep.
Who has just completed a 7-year labor of love called The Day Iceland Stood Still.
So this hits a little home for me. So I've been excited about this one just because of that. Just to give a brief little glimpse, we were fortunate to be able to watch the documentary. It is beautiful. It is amazing. For me personally, it struck home in so many ways. Honestly, it explains a lot about my people, my culture, and it put into perspective how and why I am how I am today, having to thank these women who, on October 24th, 1975, 90% of the women in Iceland left their homes, they left their jobs, they marched because they were demanding recognition, they were demanding equality or working towards it. And the job that Pam has done to tell this story is everything. And it is beautiful, it is powerful, it is impactful, and so emotional, but fun. And so I'm so excited for us to share Pam's point of view from creating this and the stories of these women that have, honored us with their story and the behind the scenes of it. And I know Pam has her resume is insane. We will be here all day if we have to go through it, but I'm just so excited to dive in and learn all about this.
Yeah. All we need to say about Pam is that she has a long line of award-winning documentaries behind her, many of them focusing on the stories of women, which are underrepresented and fascinating.
Yes.
And if you want to know more, please check the show notes. She just has a lot of work that's worth viewing, and we're so grateful to have her here today.
Here we go. Meadowscapes highlights the natural beauty of your property and reintroduces native biodiversity. The landscapes they create have a positive environmental impact while making attractive outdoor living spaces for you, and it is beneficial to pollinators, birds, and wildlife species.
Their work focuses on removing invasive plants, restoring natural habitats, creating beautiful native meadows with custom seed mixes, and designing gardens and outdoor living spaces that flow with the rhythm of your land. Welcome home to your ecological paradise.
To learn more about Meadowscapes, call them at 860-824-1188 or visit them online at www.nativemeadowscapes.com. Pam, thank you so much for joining us today and doing this virtually with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we jump right in. And since this is a Moxie by Proxy, it's a little different, but how would you define Moxie?
The word I grew up with is chutzpah, to which I'd add, maybe a dash of elegance to turn it into Moxie.
Yeah, I like that. And so we are basically, the Proxy is this documentary film that you have made. So with that definition, how would you frame the Moxie of the women who basically kind of changed Iceland's history?
I think the word Moxie was invented for these women. I mean, they were unstoppable.
Yeah,
they saw a vision of how life could and should be. And they were unshakable in working towards it. Despite, they had a lot of fun. They supported each other. They laughed a lot. They still laugh a lot. They used humor to change people's way of thinking about things. But there's no doubt about it. There was an enormous amount of courage involved because they were under attack all the time. Personal attack. These women are ugly. I won't even say some of the things that were said about them. Their bodies were described in, hideous ways. A neighbor would stop them on the street and say, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" But they, and actually one woman told me when her neighbor stopped her and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She said, just think about how it's going to be one day for your son and for your daughter, and you'll be glad. So they had this unshakable vision, which gave them the courage, but it required courage. Now nobody really, because the changes have been so positive for everyone in Icelandic society, no one really who opposed, the feminist movement now would ever admit it, or probably even remembers that they oppose. Your memory changes things over time, and now everybody's kind of bought in. But at the time there was a lot of conflict.
I think we have to backtrack just a slight for our listeners who haven't seen the documentary, just to frame what we're talking about. We are talking about October 24th, 1975 in Iceland. And the title of your film is
The Day Iceland Stood Still.
Can you explain to our listeners exactly what that meant, and then they'll understand what the significance of what you just shared?
No, absolutely. So 1975 was designated the Year of the International Woman by the United Nations. And many countries were going through a feminist movement. Certainly the United States was. And so feminist organizations were deciding how to honor that year and what they might do. Now, Iceland had a very, very strong feminist movement called the Red Stockings that started in about 1970. So by this time, they were 5 years into a very active feminist movement that was trying all kinds of different ways of making people think differently about equality between men and women, and of trying to further women's rights. So when Icelandic women learned about the designation that 1975 would be the Year of the Woman, they brought together all women from all different parts of society, not just the radical feminists, but also the conservative feminist groups that had been around for many, many, many years before 1970, and also housewives, and also politicians, and union members, the people who worked in the fish factories, teachers, and they all had kind of a gathering, a congress, to talk about how to best, advance women's rights on this day, on October 24th. And the feminists suggested, let's have a strike. And then the conservatives said, oh, no, we can't have a strike. Well, I'd never go. That's what communists do. We're not going on strike. So it looked like they were at an impasse, and they were going to leave the conference with no, nothing to show for it. And then they tell me that this kind of older conservative woman, a light bulb went off in her head, and she walked to the front of the room and she said, well, if it's the word that's a problem, let's just call it a day off. Yeah. And everybody said, oh, what a great idea. We'll take a day off. And then, of course, they for months, then they had a couple of months to get everybody in the country, to think about it and think about participating. They did an amazing job. Yeah. There was no social media at the time. They used, actually, well, of course, they worked with newspapers and magazines and radio to get the word out and get people excited about it. But they also worked with a very traditional method of women gathering, which were these kind of sewing clubs, so that way out in the hinterlands and in places where maybe the people couldn't travel that easily from Reykjavik to talk to people in some of these places, they contacted these sewing groups where women would meet at night and just talk. Apparently they didn't do a heck of a lot of sewing. It was more like an excuse to drink coffee and talk. And they used those very effectively to get the word out. So when the morning came, October 24th, no one really knew what was going to happen. And some of the women thought they might be the only ones standing there in the square. And actually 90% of the women walked off the job and out of their home. They didn't take care of the children. They didn't cook. They didn't work. And they brought the country to a complete standstill. Planes couldn't go off. People couldn't make phone calls because the switchboard operators weren't working. The men had to cook, and the men didn't know how to cook. One of the women said that in those days, men didn't even know how to make a cup of coffee. But here the kids had to be fed. So they, the stores ran out of hot dogs because that's what the men were going to make. In fact, the president of Iceland was 8 years old at the time, and he participated in an interview, and he has a very sad, tragic memory of his dinner that night because his father, was going to cook while the mother was out at the demonstration. And he said, kids, we're going to have hot dogs. So he and his brother were really, really excited. They loved hot dogs. And of course, the father burned them. So that was a tragic memory that we had a lot of fun creating an animated sequence for. Actually, our animator, in order to make the sound of them eating these hideous burned hot dogs, he used the sound of potato chips. And it's really very effective. So they brought the country to a standstill, and things started to change. Immediately. I mean, a year
Yes.
later, Iceland passed a law outlawing gender discrimination. 5 years later, they were the first country to democratically elect a female head of state, Vigdis Finnbogadóttir, and she served for 16 years and is still an icon, a legend. And today they're considered the most gender equal country in the world and have been for the past 16 years on all the kind of major, measures. It's not a gender paradise, and sometimes there's some mythologizing out there that it is a gender paradise. Actually, they had a huge demonstration this year on the 48th anniversary of the strike, excuse me, day off. And actually, it's the biggest demonstration that's ever been had in Iceland. And the theme of this year's demonstration was, you call this equality? And the point was, we know we're number one, but we're not there yet. There's still, we're still there's still a gender wage gap, and there's sexual violence, and, there's still a ways to go. And actually this year they really felt that because we are a leader and everyone looks to us, we need to take that responsibility and
Yes.
point out what still has to be done.
I think my best friend, when she messaged me that day, and technically it's last year now because it's 2023, right? And she messaged me. She's like, yeah, I think if I remember the time correctly, she's like, at 2:23 we have to leave. And, that's when we're doing it. And I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? She's like, well, technically, if you break it down, we are only getting paid to work until 2:23. If, just I'm thinking that was around the time. And men are getting paid until 5 o'clock. So you know what? That's what we're doing. We're leaving. We're making a stand. We have to. And she's like, my partner, he's got the boys because she has 2 boys, and I'm marching. And I was like, okay.
It's such a great way to do it. That's an example of how creative Iceland's feminist movement is. Just by leaving at 2:23, you're really able to visualize that there's free labor happening after that much more easily than when you say, well, we make 13% less than, now you're doing math, but
Yeah.
now it's like, no, actually for the rest of the day, I'm volunteering my time.
Yeah.
And that's not right.
Quiet quitting on another level.
Exactly.
I was interested in, kind of, not to spoil anything, but at the end of the film, one of the editors of the newspaper, a man, came on and was saying that at the time they didn't realize, the leadership of the newspaper didn't realize the historical significance of what the women were doing. And I thought that was so interesting, because in your interviews with the women, they seem to be fully aware in the moment of what they were doing with history. I don't know did I get the right impression of that? Like, that they knew at the time they were doing this, that they were changing history.
I think you're right. That's a really interesting observation, Mary. I think the women did. They knew they were doing something very important, and they knew that it was happening in other countries, that they were doing something transformative. Now, that was a fascinating interview with Stürmer of the Morgenbladet newspaper. That's the equivalent of the New York Times, but it's considered very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And he at the time was not covering the feminist movement. I said to him, Stürmer, were you, because the women were working with a lot of the progressive newspapers to get the word out, to write articles about why having childcare would be important and so forth. And he wasn't covering them. And he said, no, Pam, I was focusing on the Cold War. That's what I was focusing on. And so it's interesting because his wife was a feminist and his mother-in-law was the mayor of her small town. But as a journalist, he was hell-bent on, covering what he thought were the issues of the day, and it was not feminism. And then he changed over time, and he was able to really see that he had missed something, and that these women had changed Icelandic society for the better. And he has daughters who came. Sadly, he died before 3 of the people in the film died before we finished. But his daughters came to the sneak preview we had at the Reykjavik Film Festival in October, and they were very happy that he was part of the story.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, his perspective on it, and I think it really added to this storytelling of the day. And as Mary picked up on that it kind of highlighted the significance of what was happening. But I found it, I was telling Mary before, the fact that you have Vigdis Finnbogadóttir as one of the interviewees, and when I started watching, I'm like, why aren't they introducing her as the president? Because I grew up, born in the early 80s in Iceland. I always knew that was my president. And she was this beautiful, beautiful, elegant lady who was so well-spoken and cultured. And at the end, where you introduce everyone and their significance, I was like, oh, that makes so much more sense and so much more impactful. But just having these various people who have shaped the country and, well, the entire world in a way, but, being the icon that, they are. And I was telling Mary too, I didn't realize that she wanted to be a captain.
She wanted to be the captain of a ship.
Yeah.
When she was little, and people told her, you can't because you're a woman. And it's just so funny to think that she ended up being the head of state for 16 years, meeting Ronald Reagan and the Pope, and having so much influence. So she got her wish and more, I would say.
She was the biggest captain.
She was the captain of the captains. Actually, when she was deciding whether to run, one of the things that decided her that she would run was a group of men on a ship sent her a telegram and said, "We think you should run. You'd be a fantastic leader." Yeah, and it's my understanding that as the years went by and she kept being reelected, little boys thought that they couldn't be president when they grew up.
Speaking of the ship, that segment of the three women who were on the ship to
Russia,
shine shoes and make beds and meals, that was scary to me. That made me really feel the force of what these women were doing, to be three women locked in a room with a ship full of men where there could be a herd mentality situation. That really struck me. I don't know if you have anything to say about that part.
I get chills when I think about their courage. They stayed in their pajamas all day. The men started off, kind of laughing about it, and then they were getting really mad. They wanted their meals and enough already, and they just kept harassing the women and beating on the door. And not only did the women refuse to get out of their pajamas and do any of the work, and there they are out in the middle of the sea. They could be thrown, off the ship. They also marched upstairs and convinced the captain's son, who was the telegraphist, to send a telegram to be read to the people in the protest in Reykjavik. And he didn't want to send it. He thought that he was going to get in trouble, but they did not back down. And the amazing thing too is, and I will say too, that was an example where animation was really important to help us dramatize the danger that they were in, because there aren't any pictures from that day. There's no video, there's no film. But, our animator kind of shows these big men with their big, hands, banging on the door, and you really get the sense of danger by being able to use that animation. Then what happened was the next morning, they didn't know what was going to happen, and they were kind of scared the next morning. There was a knock on their door first thing in the morning, and a man on the other side said, "The captain wants to see you in his quarters," which, they would never go to those quarters. So they went upstairs, and the captain offered them coffee and wine and beer. And he said, "My wife was in the square and heard the telegram being read, and she got in touch with me and said, 'You've got 3 heroines on the ship. Treat them well.'"
Wow.
Isn't that incredible?
It is incredible. That segment just really struck me. And I was curious about your use of animation, the juxtaposition of the historical footage with the animation that was kind of fun, but still conveyed the messages. And then also those amazing shots of the natural beauty.
Yep.
And I was really struck at one point where you were talking about how the women were talking about how they were being described in not so complimentary ways, and compared them to trolls, and how you projected these face-like figures in the rocks that had that appearance. And so how much thought, when you're making a film, goes into those kinds of overlays?
So much thought. And we worked on this film for 7 years. It's a true independent production, so it took us a long time to fundraise. There was a really good, it actually turned out to be good that we worked on it for 7 years, because as an American, I spent 7 years learning, getting more deeply knowledgeable about Icelandic culture. And, my collaborator is a fantastic filmmaker, Icelandic filmmaker, Rapa Gunnarsdóttir. And she had a fantastic team of researchers and so forth in Iceland. And so, for example, with the trolls, that is an Icelandic belief. It's not something that tourists made up.
Nope.
And it probably, kids were told about that there were trolls as a way to keep them safer. That, if you did certain things, if you ran out of your backyard and just went wandering, a troll might come and something might happen to you, and that was a way to keep kids safer. But it also was a very terrible thing to say that the red stockings, the feminists, were worse than trolls. It's like the worst thing you can say about somebody.
Yep.
And so we and our wonderful editor Kate Taverna, who's just she's an artist actually, and a sculptor, and she revels in visualizations. When we found those images of the stones that look like the profile of a very mean man or woman, we couldn't help but use them to try. And we also found that the women very spontaneously in our interviews often used imagery that related to the landscape of Iceland. So they would talk about, we felt things underneath the surface. Well, even as you and I speak today, there's a volcano that just exploded. Things are always happening under the surface in Iceland. Or they in our opening, they say, I had shivers. I was frozen. Well, in Iceland, the wind, even in July, can freeze you. I mean, I was there in July finishing the film, and there was one day the wind was so strong, I couldn't open the hotel door by myself to leave the hotel.
Sounds about right.
So they use this imagery, and the more we heard them using it, because when you're editing, we edited for like 9 or 10 months, you hear the words over and over and over, and the more we heard them, the more we thought, you want visuals to go with what they're saying. So started using those, and it was really fun. And then of course our animator, picked up on it too.
For me, I felt homesick seeing all those. I'm like, oh yeah, oh you're in Vik, you're here. I'm like, because I'm glad you got that being there and immersed in it, because the land is so rich in us as a culture, as a people, and we survived there for over 1,000 years on an island in the North Atlantic, and it's part of our psyche, it's part of our DNA. And so I'm not surprised that the women use language like that, because it's who we are. And, and we had to survive there. And it was, as you say, it's the land of fire and ice. And we literally have fire and ice right now as we speak. And it's very ingrained in that attitude too.
Yes.
But that's also something that I was interested to see, and Mary and I were discussing. So I'm born in the early 80s, grew up in Iceland, came here and then went back. And so, I'm Icelandic 100%. I never felt a real discrimination growing up, but seeing that footage, hearing the women speak was interesting to me, because it made me realize, wait a second, they completely changed my life. And I had to laugh when they were talking about, the stressors of Christmas and having to make 5, 8, 10 different cookies, because we still do that. My grandmother's every Christmas, my mother is baking, because we have to make the different variations, and everyone had clothes, new clothes. And like growing up, my mom used to sew clothes for us. I mean, it's part of schooling. We have to learn how to sew, how to knit, and even the boys do. But going like to grammar school, we are the boys and the girls, we are going to sewing class together. We're going to shop class together, and we are doing everything equally. And so having grown up in that, and it's an era, like, so when Vigdís Finnbogadóttir was speaking that she wanted to be the captain, in my mind, I'm like, of course she can be the captain, because, they led the way for my generation to be like, I want to be a captain. I'm going to be a freaking captain. And there's nothing to stop me. And so it made me realize, and so thankful that they did what they did that day, because it has changed the trajectory of the entire country. And now, as you had the stats at the end about how many women are 48% in Congress over there. They make up, 62% of the lawyers studying law are women. And I'm like, yeah, of course they are. But it was very poignant for me also as an Icelandic woman to see that, and to see these women who were having fun and who were smiling now today talking about it, and at the time. So how was that for you to live through that again with them and see their faces and the reactions? Because you can't but see the joy is emanating from them in your video.
Well, to go back to your point that growing up, you didn't know it had ever been different. That's why we made the film. If you don't tell the stories, it never happened. And unfortunately, women's history is often overlooked. Yeah. And this was really kind of the last chance to tell the story, for the women to tell the story themselves. It would always be a part of history somewhere. Every year, The Guardian or the BBC, write a little paragraph about what happened that day, but to have the women tell it in their own words. As soon as I started meeting them, once I had the idea that this might make a good film, I started meeting some of them. And then it was, how could I not make this film? Because they're so fabulous and so still just so alive and strong and funny, and their memories are so present, and they all get together and have dinner together at least 4 times a year. They've recently created a website which will be translated to English soon. So for the first time, the world will be able to kind of do this kind of research and be in touch with the archival materials that they created and their narrative. Because at the time we started this film, there were 2 books that they had written about the movement and then about the strike, but they were in Icelandic.
Yeah.
And for anyone who doesn't know, Icelandic is not a Romance language.
It isn't?
I love hearing you speak I love hearing you say the names, because in 7 years I still haven't been able to even say the names of people I've interviewed in the right way. So we had to, have things translated, and it was a very long, costly process, but it was totally worth it. But what's great is they understand the value of the history. And the importance of succeeding generations, not just yours, but hundreds of years from now, that everyone in the country and really the world know what they were able to do. And if they were here as part of this conversation we're having, they would be the first to say, sometimes people from other countries say, it's amazing what you did, but we could never do that here. And I just have to ask you, how do you know? How do you know if you don't try? They would say that to us right now. America, by the same scale that puts Iceland as #1 for gender equality, we're 43rd. We're a dismal 43rd. We're behind countries that aren't even industrialized. And, we have so few women, for example, in elected positions, in Congress. And that's one of the first things that happened after the strike and the years following the strike, was women realized that we have to start getting into elected positions locally and nationally. And then they formed a women's party. So then the Red Stockings Party that had kind of been behind the strike and so forth kind of started to fade out, and a new party came in, a party dedicated to getting women elected. And the funny thing is that the men who were running the other parties then saw, oh, we better do that too. So everybody started putting women on the ticket. And look, now they're, and once you start having a core group of women, not just one woman being elected in a symbolic way, but a lot of women being elected, then you start having laws having to do with subsidized childcare and daycare, and not just babysitting, but daycare where the kids are learning.
Yeah.
And learning socialization. I think all that history and is so important for all of us, all of us other countries who are lagging behind, to see that there are ways, and to be inspired.
Elise Harney Real Estate is the #1 real estate agency for the tri-state region, and they provide a comprehensive overview of the regional market spanning Litchfield, Dutchess, Columbia, and Berkshire counties.
Elise Harney Real Estate serves 40 unique communities with 35 years of experience. They have a team of knowledgeable real estate professionals to work with you to buy or sell your house.
Their offices are located in Salisbury, Millerton, Norfolk, Falls Village, and Riverton, or you can visit them online at www.harneyrealestate.com.
Well, I think the Icelandic psyche is, if there's a will, there's a way. And I was telling Mary before, I was raised from both my parents, who they always told me, and my brother, there's nothing stopping you. You are the only thing that is stopping you. And watching the film, it kind of reminded me of that, and what a privilege it is to come from a country where it is, it doesn't matter your gender, doesn't matter, none of that matters. It's just who you are, and you are capable if you put your mind to it.
That's wonderful.
Pam, how much do you think, watching the film and seeing all this, I don't know if serendipity is the right word, but this confluence of events and timing to come up with this formula? A year later, would it have been possible? A year earlier, would it have been possible? It just seems like everything was coming together to create this moment. I wonder, did you feel that, or
That's so interesting. There is serendipity. In a way, it seems like it was meant to be, because all the years of organizing and so forth that preceded that day. But think about it. If that day, in October 24th, I mean, the weather could be anything. It could be, you could,
Yes.
you could wake up and learn that the roads had been shut down and that the buses weren't going to be able to make it into Reykjavik to have a demonstration, that you'd be risking your life to go into Reykjavik and stand on the streets. So that day it was sunny. And, when you look at the archival footage, you don't even see people, wrapped in a million layers. They look like the sun is coming down on them, and they're having a beautiful afternoon, and they're happy and they're joyful, which they wouldn't have been if the weather had been bad that day.
No.
So that's why, and this is part of our film, is as one of the strike organizers was driving one of the speakers home with her 13-year-old son in the back seat. And they were talking about how we were so lucky. We're so lucky with the weather. Their son said, well, now we know that God is a woman.
I love that. I love that part.
That was a great way to end. Spoiler alert.
But yes, there was serendipity. And I think somehow, how I think about it a lot, how that morning, maybe not so much the people in Reykjavik, because you know that you're going to the radio station, and you know that when you left the night before, your colleagues said that we're all going to meet and then we're all going to walk out at 1:00. So maybe those people kind of knew that they wouldn't be alone. But I just think about the people in the hinterlands, these fishing villages. They also woke up and said, I'm just going to go to the community center, and I don't know if anybody's going to join me, but I'm going to do that. And I'm going to tell my husband, who I love, and my 3 sons, who I adore, I'm not cooking for you today. But they did it all over Iceland. I think they've counted something like 17 tiny little, hamlets where people did what they did, just stopped doing what women normally do, so that the people in that hamlet would see how valuable the paid and the unpaid work of the women was, and start to really think about that.
Did you get a sense that any of the women were in fear of bodily harm, that the men in their family would react?
That's a really good question. By being in the feminist movement and by doing what they did that day, it did create conflict in families, and there were a lot of divorces, and there was a lot of conflict. They don't really talk about that. It's more what they talk, the women who are feminists in the years leading up to this do talk about. Sometimes there were fights in the streets, sometimes they were physically attacked. They would go to meetings like the men, Iceland has very long, dark winters. Thorin can speak to that, and people find ways to entertain themselves. And one of the ways is there would be groups of men, I forget, they would different societies of men, forget the names of these groups, and they would gather and talk about social issues once a week or once a month. So they would invite the feminists as a form of entertainment, but they never went alone. 2 would go at the same time. They never went alone. And sometimes there would be a lot of arguments, and they would be kind of condescended to. And other times, there would be really productive conversations.
On the website for the film, you talk about how you found this story. And I'm wondering if you can describe that a little bit, and also about what it's like to have that spidey sense that you've landed on something worth telling. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Sure. Yeah. My family, we went on a trip to Iceland. And my husband and son are really big photographers, and they kept leaving the car and, spending a lot of time, photographing the gorgeous landscape. So I'd be in the car, and I was just reading the Lonely Planet guide. And then on one of the back pages, there was this paragraph. Well, I had noticed already that there were a lot of statues to women in Iceland.
Yep.
And I'd also noticed how cool the women were, like with wearing these boots and colored hair. I was just like, I thought the women were really cool. And I wondered about all the statues, because we don't really, right now here in New York City in Central Park, we've got a movement to put statues of women in Central Park, because most of the statues are of the men, but Iceland, there are a lot of women. So then I read this paragraph that said what had happened on October 24th, and that today Iceland was leading the world in gender equality. And literally my head exploded. I wasn't looking to make a film. I had just finished a film. I was enjoying a little time off. It just, my head exploded, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, to the point, I immediately went to my computer and, documentary about Iceland women's strike, and I couldn't find it. So I said, oh, wow, I can't believe that. And then I came home, and apparently I kept talking about it to the point where a friend of mine got so annoyed. She said, Pam, You need to, she worked for a production company that gave grants for research and development. And she said, here's what you're going to do, Pam. You're going to stop talking about it and you're going to write a proposal and you're going to give it to my company. And that was Abby Disney's company, Fork Films, which was very supportive of women's stories about women. And they gave us an R&D grant. And so I was able to come back to Iceland and do our first shoot. And at that point, I knew that we had a story because the women involved were just so vibrant, and the story was so much richer than I had ever even imagined.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was at I went to the Sheffield Film Festival a few years ago when we were in the middle of making the film. And I had the pleasure of listening to Werner Herzog give a talk about his process. And he said, sometimes a story, it's like a burglar that breaks into your house and it just starts charging at you. And I was like, Werner, that's what happened to me with this story. Because, as the years went by, it was harder to raise money for it than I had expected. And then we had the COVID lockdown for 2 years and we had to do remote shoots. By then I had the wonderful Icelandic collaborators and we were able to do it actually almost seamlessly with me on a computer in the United States and them in the room with the people that we were interviewing. But it just, my sense of urgency never left, and that this was all I thought about every morning for 7 years. First thing when I woke up, and last thing when I went to bed. And I'm so happy that we were able to finish it when the women were still here. And because as in the process of research, I'd hear about some fantastic woman who had done some really interesting thing that hadn't yet been documented. And I would make the phone call and it would be her niece on the phone saying, well, my aunt isn't really as well as she used to be. And the memories aren't really, or the phone would keep ringing and then I'd be told that the person had died. So we kept finding that it was the last moment. And so that was one reason that just kept driving me. We have to do this now. We have to do this now. There was one amazing woman who I discovered her very early on in the research. And I asked her if we could interview her the first shoot. And she said, no, I'll be picking blueberries that week. And she was in her 80s. And, because you have to take Thorin, I mean, when it's sunny, you got to pick the blueberries. You can't do it the next week.
I'm laughing because I just had a flashback of picking blueberries with my grandmother. The sun's out. We're going right now because it could snow in July. You never know.
Maybe this woman was your grandmother. But then fortunately, the next year, we were able to come back the next year and she was able to do the interview. She's a huge part of the film and she's no longer with us. So I'm just so grateful that the next year she wasn't picking blueberries that week.
So it is time to segue a bit into you, Pam, and how Moxie has worked in your life through the films you make, through the choices you make, through hearing stories of the people that you're making films about, how you've been marinating in that. What drives you, what attracts you as a story for a documentary filmmaker?
A lot of my career, I've been what's called a gatekeeper. I've been an executive producer. So I'm reading or taking pitches from thousands of filmmakers all over the world. So I'm hearing story ideas all the time and developing a pretty firm sense of, yes, that's a good one. Let's go with that. So I guess the same thing happens when I get exposed to ideas. I use the same critical faculty. If something just won't leave me and I'm just really excited and I can't wait to tell someone about it, then I think it's worth exploring. And I certainly think one of the reasons that I've ended up making a lot of films about women all over the world is that those stories are just told less often and they're so good. Yeah. They're so terrific. It's a joy and a privilege really to make stories that are being overlooked and then to have people appreciate them. And once that film is there, that moment of history never goes away and it'll be with us for generations to come. As far as the Moxie goes, that has to come from my mother. Because my sister and I were raised by a single mom. She and my dad divorced when I was a baby. And she was a writer, a really good writer. So she got work writing for a radio station and then writing for television and writing for an advertising company that had different clients. And there was always food on the table. And we lived in a town with fantastic public schools. And we sewed our own clothes, which was actually kind of fun. Maybe I feel an affinity for Icelanders because we had less money. We sewed our own clothes. And it was fun, like learning how to put in a zipper. But it was hard for her. My sister and I didn't really feel it because she did a great job of making sure we had food and clothes, but she had to pay the bills. And I do remember coming through her home office one night, watching her pay bills. She didn't know I was awake, and she was crying because she couldn't pay them all. And then she discovered, when I was probably about 12 years old, that she was making half what the men were making at the advertising company. And, she had noticed that they had people who could come and clean their houses, or they could own a house, and we couldn't do any of that. She'd noticed that, but she didn't know. And these were the early days of feminism in the United States. It was the same thing was going on here at the exact same time as it was going on in Iceland. And she literally became a feminist overnight, which was not her bent. I mean, she'd never been outspoken or political. She became the first head of the Boston chapter of the National Organization of Women. And suddenly I'm coming home from high school, and there's angry women sitting on our floor having a consciousness raising session, And she actually quit her job and started a newsletter having to do with affirmative action legislation in Washington. And she was in charge of trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in Massachusetts, which we did pass, although it never passed in the country. So that's the Moxie that she had to raise us that way. And I've read her papers since then. They're at the Schlesinger Library for the History of Women in Cambridge. I realize now by reading them how angry she was, how angry what was going on at work was making her. And I didn't know that at the time. So she had the Moxie to go every day and be in this men's world and hold her own. And then to be a terrific mother at home and not let us know how angry she was. And then to go out and try and change it so that our lives could be better.
Wow.
Did you feel, when you talk about the Icelandic women, that there was this underlying joy and fun? Was that not present in the women's movement?
I don't think our movement. I don't think our movement used playfulness and humor in the same way that the Icelanders did. I think that's part of the secret of the Icelandic women's success. One of the women told me, this isn't in the film, but she said, "Well, come on, Pam, think about it. If you want to get somebody to listen to an idea of yours, are you going to give them a piece of rye bread, or are you going to give them a cupcake?" So, it's like they knew that by using humor, one of them said, we changed people's ears. We made them hear differently. And they did that with humor. Yeah. So, for example, when the women, and this is in the film, there was a feminist movement felt very strongly that women shouldn't be judged by their body, the size of their waist, that it should be who you are inside. And there was a lot of attention in Iceland to beauty everywhere, to women's beauty, outside beauty. So when the feminists were in a small town one day working with labor leaders there to talk about wages for women, they learned that there was going to be a beauty contest at the town hall. And they said, well, we know a farmer who has this really pretty cow. Maybe we should bring the cow to the beauty contest as a way of getting people to think. We judge livestock. The cows do receive prizes for being a certain way, looking a certain way. There's all kinds of livestock competitions all over Iceland. Let's make the connection. So they did. They put the cow on a bus. I don't know how they did that. Talk about Moxie. They brought the cow to the community center, and nobody wanted to go to the beauty contest because, this cow was there, and they all started talking about what was going on. They handed out leaflets to raise questions. Everybody started talking. It was in all the papers the next day, both local and national. And that stopped beauty contests from happening in Iceland for a number of years. So, that's an example of the playfulness that I don't think our movement here had. No, I don't see that.
Well, it's interesting because the Red Stockings movement, it was kind of militant anti-male. And yet they were able to soften that when you said, we don't see all men as male chauvinists, we're just looking to change them a little, or something like that. How do you think they were able to kind of soften the message to make it a cupcake?
Well, by using humor. And they weren't anti-male. As a matter of fact, they welcome men in the movement, and we interview one of them. They weren't anti-male. It was all about appreciating the worth of women's paid and unpaid work and equality. Paying a woman. I mean, women weren't even allowed to apply for some jobs. They would advertise for a man for this job and a woman for that job. And then the woman, if she had children, could only work 4 hours a day because then the kids would come home for lunch. So it was about those kinds of issues rather than ever being anti-male.
Oh, so the Red Stockings wasn't more strident?
Well, they were radical. And a lot of people, that's why they were so threatening. And that's why there was so much anger directed at them. And, horrible op-eds in the newspapers and depictions of them in really awful ways, because they were threatening the status quo.
Right.
So they were adamant and they were radical, but they were not anti-male.
Got it. Okay.
In fact, Elizabeth, one of the strike organizers and one of the heartbeats of the Red Stockings movement, she's very strong, and she tends to be very serious when we talk, because she's really recalling all the moments, and she wants to be on the record. The one time she laughed hysterically was when I said, "Did you hate men?" And she just couldn't stop laughing. She thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. It was absurd. No, we didn't hate men.
Yeah.
I feel like it's such a lesson in branding of a message to get the housewife in the village to join in with the radio station and the newspaper and the bank, somewhat professional. They were professional women to the extent that they could be, and how they were able to create a unifying thread in a way that when I think of like Betty Friedan versus Phyllis Schlafly, like that divide couldn't have been bridged.
Totally. I think it's I think what they did is a game plan for any grassroots movement, really. There's a lot of wisdom there that can inspire, really anybody that wants to join hands with others to change anything.
And are you changed? Oh, sorry, Thorin.
No,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say it just proves that there's a will, there's a way.
Sometimes, we talked a lot about the fact that Iceland is a small society, and often the women would say to me, maybe we understand the importance of the individual, because each of us has to wear so many hats in order to get through the day. And what we in our larger society maybe don't understand how much power we have as individuals, and maybe we can learn something from them.
You feel changed?
They've changed me. These women have changed me, yeah. And making the film has changed me. And they are the ones who pointed out to me something I didn't know. They said, you're making this film for your mother, right?
Well, there are worse reasons to make a film than for your mom. Has it impacted how you see your future going forward, projects that you'll undertake, or now that you've given birth to this 7-year baby?
Well, I'll it'll have to be a burglar who breaks into the house to make me go through another 7-year process. But if that burglar breaks in, I apparently I'm not capable of saying no.
Yeah, exactly. So we're kind of at the end of the road here. Thorin, do you have any last thoughts or questions for Pam before we ask the final question?
No, I think in a roundabout way, we kind of covered almost all of it, that we kind of had the main points of. There are so many sub questions that, we could go on for hours, just examining the minutia of the various factors. But I just want to thank you for following through and making this film, because after watching it, it is so important. And I am shocked to hear that there wasn't something, a documentary film or more books or more, about, because as a culture, we love records. There's a reason that Decode Genetics and other companies are, examining hereditary diseases and stuff, because Iceland has kept meticulous records, and I can trace my heritage back over 1,000 years. And so we are known for that. So I'm so surprised that they hadn't kept records or made more about this, significant event. So I think it's even more important that this film was made and is bringing to light. And I'm so glad it has been, and hopefully it will encourage more to be written and done, and just to make people like me realize that it wasn't always this way. And here's the reason why. And here are the people who are still living and amongst us who did change the trajectory of our entire nation. So I just want to thank you personally for bringing it to my attention and kind of explaining a little bit of why I am how I am, because of the society that, and my grandmothers, my great grandmothers, my mother, and my daughter, and how, it's generational impact.
That's wonderful, Thorin. Really wonderful. And we are making, once the film is out and in distribution, we're going to donate all of our raw interviews to the Women's Archive.
Good.
So that they'll be available for researchers, because although there is some documentation in Iceland, in Icelandic, this documentation will be in English, because even when we conducted an interview in Icelandic, we have the translation into English.
Yeah, as one should, only about 500,000 people know Icelandic, so
It's a beautiful language.
it's a little different, the language.
I absolutely love it.
How can people watch this film?
Well, stay tuned. We've applied to festivals. We're talking with sales agents and distributors, and we really just finished it. So, and we don't have a studio behind us. It's a true independent effort. So we're hoping to get distribution soon, and that it'll be widely available.
And so but the website is where we could find information about that.
Yes, we'll keep the website
which we'll
updated.
have
Absolutely.
in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Pam, thank you so much. But we
Thank
have
you.
one more question.
Oh,
If you could provide a little bit of advice from the women of Iceland or from yourself about how someone can move their own Moxie needle just a bit in a way that makes sense for them, what would you say?
I just say go with your gut. Listen to your inner voice. Try and tune out what other people are saying. If you think there's something you need to do or an idea that you have that you need to follow through on, listen to your inner voice. Trust your inner voice.
That's the best advice.
Yes, one that I could use at any moment in time in my own life. So, Pam, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it was 4 years ago that Main Street put out an article about the making of this film.
Yeah.
And here it is. We're come full circle with you. So really grateful to have the opportunity.
Thank you, Mary and Thorin. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Pam.
Wow. Thorin.
Wow.
Thorin, thoughts?
I have so many. I was moved by the film itself, and as I said, I couldn't stop thanking Pam at the end for making this, because when you come to realization that you were missing something, and that to me, having also been a history major, seeing how and why things are today, how they are, and getting that little puzzle piece and you pop it into place, and it's like, I see the full picture. That was really what that moment was for me, watching the film and then getting kind of behind the scenes information from Pam. But it explains so much about this country that I love, this country that, I have generations of 1,000 years worth of relatives, who come from that. And to understand it now in a different light, I'm just talking completely personally. Everyone's going to take something different away. But for me, it was such an impact to see my people in this light. And I think Pam did a wonderful job, and her entire team, in telling the story and sharing the story of these women in their own words, and seeing them smile when they're telling it. It gave me goosebumps over and over. And just seeing Pam's light, she lit up when she was talking about it. I almost wish that people could see the light emanating from her and the joy of sharing the story. But what about you? You're an American. What do you think?
I was just dumbfounded by what these women were able to accomplish.
Yeah.
In 1975, something that we weren't able to accomplish in this country to the same extent, and still haven't been. I love Pam's pitbull dedication to a story and her single-mindedness about it, and yet incredibly collaborative venture, one that I think conveys the joy and the fun that the women had in the face of some serious business that they were out to accomplish. And I enjoy hearing what goes on behind the scenes in the head of someone like Pam as she's doing it. So I'm just so grateful to be able to have seen the film and have talked with her, and now I have a better understanding of you.
Uh-oh.
No, in a good way. I mean, I see it really is in your DNA, your approach to life. And so I thought that was really interesting, because you're my bridge to Iceland.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. So I'm just really happy that we could have Pam on.
I'm so excited also to see, after we start recording, she was telling us about the rollout of this, and she's applying to film festivals. And I'm just so excited for her and her entire team when it does get into theaters and in front of people, and for them to get the feedback and reactions, because I think it'll be a lot like, ours. I hope it's a lot like ours, that it's just inspiring and beautiful and so motivational. And like, if there was ever a film about Moxie, oh my God, this is it. This is the epitome of it. And I'm so proud, raising my hands up, that it's my ancestors, if you will, my cousins, my aunts and that are doing it, that have been doing it.
I think we need to get her to change the name of the film to The Day Iceland Showed Moxie. Anyway,
might be too late for that, but we could always put it in order.
Anyway, Thorin, till next time.
Mary, see you later.
This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Meadowscapes, a division of Matt's Landscaping, and Elise Harney Real Estate.